The biggest group of death ever returns. This is innovation at the peak of his powers. He had absolutely mastered the methodical macro Terran mindset and looked unstoppable in this GSL run. This was also the time in which Terran was incredibly powerful and very fun to play. If you were a Terran player and you played in this era, this is one of your favorite eras because Terran was just incredibly powerful and had a ton of punching power, and you could play Terran very aggressively. This was without a doubt the most highly anticipated group of death in GSL history, even more so than the one in January of 2011 with Shinro and Idra, because we can see life and innovation are both in this group, and they were without a doubt the best players of their race at the time, and people were very excited to see what they would do with the new weapons they had available to them. There they are, Life on the right. This is before he did anything duplicitous and was disgraced. He was at the peak of his powers here. He was right in the middle of his back-to-back MLG Dallas titles, where I actually met him. And this is an incredibly talented macro Zerg that can really flip on the aggression switch and make you look bad. He'll open with early pool builds more than a lot of other really consistent top flight Zergs, and this was a terror, a tournament-winning S-Class Gosu, who, like I said, he's at the peak of his powers, and I'm not saying that to add hype. We have his entire career arc cataloged, and I was watching it live the whole time. Same with Innovation, who's now in the military. We can see when they were at their best and when people thought they were the scariest, because I've checked in after and looked at some of these old Tastosis VODs, and they're talking about these players as the best. And if you remember, they were terrifying. They were doing severe damage at every foreigner tournament they went to. They were the perennial favorites to win GSL. This was my favorite season of GSL because this was the one where everyone pretty much stopped playing Brood War. And what ended up happening was you had all of the S-Class Brood War legends come over, and that was interesting because a lot of people had stayed in Brood War, the biggest names, your Flashes, your Jaedongs, your Bisus. These players had just continued to play Brood War, done some sort of half-ass split, because there was this weird gimmicky Pro League season where half the matches were StarCraft 2 and half of them were Brood War, which really made no sense. And it was interesting to note that this was the most interesting GSL season we had seen to date because people had been asking themselves since StarCraft 2 was in beta and Wings of Liberty back in like March of 2010, wow, what if Flash played? What if Jaedong played? What would he be doing? The Zerg players who would get rushed and destroyed on Steps of War would often think to themselves, well, you know, if only Jaedong was playing, we might actually have some sort of breakthrough. And it would have been interesting to see Jaedong play in Wings of Liberty because he was always a player who, whenever he would turn on the aggressive switch, he would just immediately flip and go so aggressive and micro so well. He was a lot like Life in that regard. If you look at the players stylistically, they're almost stylistically identical. They're very fast, they're not afraid to be aggressive, and they are players who do not rattle, and they're very confident, and they're multi-time tournament winners as far as Jaedong in Brood War and Life in StarCraft 2. Life at this time was so incredibly fierce and just absolutely revered as the guy that you look to see what he did, and he was the guy that really set the standard for the race as far as the gold standard and what good players would try to emulate and do. There are certain players that pro gamers will stay up till 5 a.m. and watch the GSL live because it's like, well, if you don't watch it live, you're not even going to be able to play ladder tomorrow, A, and B, you revere them so much, you want to see what the cutting edge of the matchup is. You want to see what their response to the common flavor of the month build order is. And Innovation is going for CC first on the high ground. Life, of course, has expanded down onto the low ground. Inno's taken a gas. And you guys can see what's happening on your screen. You don't need me to pedantically describe a CC first on the high ground, every little detail. I think it's more important to fill in the historical details and where the players were in their careers at the time. Because the other two members of this group, Flash was of course the best player ever in Brood War and best pro gamer ever, And Parting, like I said, won the big premier tournament at the end of the year where all the regions sort of competed against one another. It was just like the WCG format, where each country sent representatives, like Idra and Vibe and Scarlet went for the Americas, etc. Parting went. But when Parting won that finals, it was sort of like the last huge tournament in Wings of Liberty in some regards, because even though not everyone switched at the same time, that was sort of the point in which Broodlord and Fester had been established as very powerful, but it hadn't gotten to the point where it was completely killing the game in the sense that the beta was out and people had switched over. And for whatever reason, Blizzard sort of left Broodlord and Fester in the stage that it was in, and that was like, if you went back and played Wings of Liberty, like the vanilla game, Wings of Liberty itself, then that would be like the go-to strategy. You would play Broodlord and Fester, but a lot of the player base was lost whenever Blizzard did nothing about that, and I think they sort of thought like, well, we don't want to do another big patch, like the expansion's coming out in months. I'll get excited for it. It was almost like they thought that was like their business model, like, oh, you want Broodlord and Fester to be fixed? Well, buy the new game, lol. Well, every StarCraft player was gonna fucking buy the new game. They should have toned that down in some way before, where the metagame wasn't dominated by that for, what, a ridiculous amount of time for a game like this, like over a year. And I've said this before and I'll say it again as you see some Hellions poking around, and just your standard macro play here from Innovation. The Hellion, it doesn't really need to be ostentatiously over-commentated. Innovation's just going to poke around, take tower control, try to limit creep spread. It's life. He's not going to lose a bunch of drones, lol. Double upgrades coming for Inno, at least the eBay part. Notice how late life is to get Ling speed, relying really on queens. But like I was going to say, it's worse for a game if a metagame is really popular, if it's a defensive one that leads to boring stalemate games like the Swarm Host. Like, it's better for something that's over aggressive and something like an all-in. It's better for those things to be really popular as far as the viewing experience in an esport goes, because then at least the games are 10 minutes long and they're sort of revolving around something like the Immortal All-In. Like, the Immortal All-In being overpowered was more palatable to watch than a Broodlord and Fester game where the Zerg was going to make 30 spine crawlers and never attack until they were maxed on Broodlords. And whenever people had seen so much of that, and that was very frustrating and unrewarding to play against for Protoss and Terran players, and I mean ZVZ's a joke, so it even sort of sucked for Zerg, because in the server is a bunch of Zerg players, because all the Terran and Protoss players quit and we're waiting for a patch, as we see Innovation trying to defend these Lings. And this is something that Life always did, was try to run Lings in when you weren't expecting. A lot of players will try to do Ling run-bys, but Life was better at it than anyone. And it's really common for whenever Terran players land their third to just drop all of their mules right onto that third, because they don't want their main and natural to mine out super fast. So as they make their third and orbital, they'll bank up energy, and as soon as they land it, they'll mule hammer the shit out of it. And it's really good if you're Zerg to run in when that happens, because they lose a huge power spike that helps them go into barracks 6 through 8. Life's 1-1 is going to finish way before Inno's. Well, not way before, I take that back. They're going to finish at about the same time, but it's sort of hard to fight a Zerg that has such good micro whenever you don't have shields. So Inno really doesn't want to get too cute without shields and medevacs. Your stems are precious, your Marines don't have much health. Think about this. You can't really stem twice if you don't have combat shields, because then it's almost like if a Zerg runs up on you, it's like having a bunch of Banes if you don't have medevacs or shields. So that's sort of interesting whenever you see matchups like this, and we really see the medevac was a huge part of this metagame. Once it got boost, it became the backbone of Terran, whereas in Wings of Liberty we would see the starport delayed a lot more, especially in the first year and a half of the game. People wouldn't always get that reactor on a starport as a little poke drop occurs, and just as a little poke. It's like when Carmelo Anthony does a jab step. That's all that was. Infestors are going to come out here for Life. You had a ton of Zergs who loved to do Infestor plays, and oftentimes people are always going to try to do what was good on the last patch and see if like the old strats work. And remember, this is the first GSL and Heart of the Swarm, so innovation is going to go up against the old style, the Broodlord Infestor. Baneling Nest real late here for life. That's probably a mistake because he stayed on Lings for so long and is famous for it. I think he meant to delay it, maybe even after 2-2, which is horrible and ridiculous, honestly. But look how far his 2-2 is. He could have delayed it after 2-2. Let's just say he was really trying to get up into Hive or something. You could have done that theoretically if your micro's really good and you're going to do counterattacks, but never ever do that. If you're watching this and you're like, I want to play like life, I'm going to delay my Bane Nest. You'll just die to stupid bullshit. You want to get your Bane Nest really early, but life delayed it quite a bit. He's going into Spire too. He very clearly wants to go into Broodlord Infestor. So you might be asking yourself, so how did they fix the Broodlord Infestor era if they left Wings of Liberty really shitty and a lot of people fucked off to other scenes and never came back? Well, they made the fungal a projectile and got rid of its bonus damage to armor, and they nerfed Infested Terran to no longer have Carapace. It no longer worked with upgrades, Infested Terran. You might be asking yourself, Infested Terran? That's an Infested Terran. The old Infested Terran that look like eggs, those scaled with upgrades. The ones that look like little humans curled up into a ball don't. And this is brilliant placement here from Life, from Static, because anytime a drop comes in, it's going to come in from that top left side at that third base. So great spore placement and then really good spine placement, because that's going to help anytime the Terran sees a spine on one side, sort of lopsided, they're just going to stem and attack on the other side. It really doesn't require that much micro. That seems like a little thing as we see Bane speed being researched for Life, and innovation is going into a fourth. Life is really trying to go into this 3-3 Broodlord Infestor on this classic map, Daybreak, perhaps the most heavily played map in the competitive history of StarCraft. And innovation is intelligently splitting and not really getting chain fungled very much. It was way harder to get chain fungled when they made the fungal a projectile, and you didn't lose extra health to your armored stuff like your medevacs, for instance, or your tanks. Fungal really did get a lot worse. And of course, an Infestor had this weird period as we see innovation pushing up the middle where Neural Parasite was really good, but that was in like 2011 and that was a different nerf irrespective of what I'm talking about. Anyway, the Infestor's way cooler than it is now. Oh, we see huge friendly fire there, my god, and when I mean friendly fire, I mean just blood everywhere, and its Lings absolutely decimated and just absolutely ruined by mines. It looked like more Marines died than there did, and usually when you see that much blood, but we can see the old Widow Mine splash was insidious. There were two big factors that made Terran strong at this point as far as what got patched, and it was the splash of the mine and the Hellbat. And we can see that there as Life tried to run in with the huge swell of Lings, and it was just an absolutely catastrophic cartoonish amount of damage, and that's what made watching this era so fun, as it was such a high wire act for Zerg to try to limit themselves against this mine splash, and we would see incredibly entertaining explosive engagements like this frequently. And that was primarily seen in Mutiling Baneling style games, which are my favorite to watch and are the best in the entire game. Inno transferring a few workers to his fourth, and Life is running out of Infestor energy, and Innovation has been diligently splitting and macroing like a god, and look at that, hilariously, he made a joke Reaper, and Life made a joke Swarm Host, and that just means you made one on accident because the hotkey is something default by what you're trying to press. And Innovation crushing forward here, and when you go for this Broodlord style, you put yourself in a position where if you don't have the Infestor backbone, then you can be infinitely kited, dropped around with Marauders, and have stuff straight up dropped under your Broodlords. So Infestors are really the backbone of this composition. That's why you always hear them like whined about together, and you hear them verbally grouped all the time, Broodlord and Infestor, because the weakness of the Broodlord is it can be kited. and especially look at that splash, especially by an army that can drop. So what you want to do with the Infestor is lock stuff down, and then they have to fight the Broodlings, the free units. We can see that there, even though Life is losing bases and losing the game here, as he's getting out macroed by a macro powerhouse. And look at that, beautiful mind spread. And they did so much splash back in this day, and you didn't need an upgrade to make them invisible, as Life loses all of his Infestors there, as they were spread eloquently enough where if he didn't have the detection, he couldn't just like remember where they were and attack. And we can see a few of the swarm hosts that Life made are trying to be used to clear mines, but if you don't have the detection, there's no point, you know what I mean? So actually some of you might not, but you see what I mean now, as medevacs are being boosted around beautifully. And this is just a classic maneuver where the Zerg doesn't really have any infestors, they're behind, you're taking the whole map, and what you're doing here is you're looking for the Greater Spire, in the Hive. You know the Hive is probably always going to be in the main, and it's like 2500 health. That's always a great target. Usually that happens more when you play against Protoss, where they'll warp in your main, they'll do a Zealot DT combo, and then go after your Hive. But as Terran here, it's easier to punch out the Greater Spire with some Marauders. And Marauders, of course, is sort of the old school Wings of Liberty answer to Broodlord Infestor, which sounds hilarious. It's just a component of the response. You run around with a Marauder drop and snipe buildings, especially exterior bases. And Life has ginned up about 8 broods here, and he borrows his 2 joke swarm hosts, which is just hilarious to me because we all make swarm host by accident, and I refuse to believe that he made thee to like esoterically burrow for mines. That's just ridiculous. I know it was an accident. In Innovation, target fires the Corruptors here, and they're starting to melt, even though he has +1 air carapace, which is a tongue-in-cheek thing to say. But remember, the base count here favors the Terran player. Innovation's keeping the pressure up, and Life is going for a composition that trades really well, but at the same time, he's sort of at a middle part of the map, and he's being outmined, and he's relying a lot on the Infestors. If he doesn't hit his fungals, if he runs out of energy, it can be bad. Innovation is known for his macro ability, and is going to be able to make more Vikings than really Life can deal with. He's going to have to rely on chain fungals like this, and Innovation just trying to shut the door here as about 3 Corruptors remain. He has to pull back to avoid the Banes. That went about as well as it could for Life. If you stack up the Vikings, that can be really bad. And again, that was one of those things that in Wings of Liberty it was way easier to get your Vikings fungled because there was no projectile that would just instantly happen, and then it would do. See, he would have lost way more Vikings there. He would have gotten almost all of them fungled as opposed to about a third of them. And it does bonus damage to armored, so not only is it better in a fight, but whenever you chain fungal something, it's very punishing. And intelligently, Inno had a mine up at that ramp to that exterior base. In macro games like this, when you know your opponent is going to try to take one of these exterior bases, it's so smart to burrow a mine somewhere near it, especially on the entry path, because you know what? You're probably going to kill that drone, and it's going to happen, and if something else is going on in the game, they're not going to notice. And on some level, StarCraft is about doing things and manipulating your opponent's screen. It's like the whole concept of Baneling Bust and dropping. As you see a big droopy drop going on now, as Life is sort of forced to pick what he wants to defend, that top base that he has to have to stay in that game, or his base. Now the issue here is he really needs to defend both, obviously, but when you have a slow-moving army like this is what I was talking about, is the counter to the Broodlord is mobility and drops. And even though he obviously knows he needs to defend this, he can't, because he knows that not only is the top being attacked, but the middle is going to be attacked. That is imminent. And at this point he needs to do something. Innovation intelligently positioning out not only on the cliff but by his base. And this is where Innovation really starts to put on the gas. It's his Innovation godlike macro is just this absolutely devastating force that is incinerating his opponent in such a way that a multitude of things are occurring and making a godlike S-class multi-time tournament winner look like a chump diggity that can't multitask. because Innovation knows the limits of his opponent's unit composition, and Innovation is using his superior macro to do too many things for his opponent to handle. And at this point, enough biomine is on the ground where he can just stutter step under the broods. Now, it is a lot of broods, and there are a couple infestors, but when you shred the corruptors, everything gets easy. And at this point, life is broken. His top side is dead. He has no hive, he has no spawning pool, and he's just going to try to throw everything in here. But Innovation's macro is alive and kicking, and remember, he's still muling here. He's mining from the bottom side. Life is pretty much out of steam. The fact that he didn't have a spawning pool there is crucial, because even though you can sort of float gas in weird situations, this is a guy who is known for using lings and being obnoxious and utilizing counterattacks. You just have to have the spawning pool because you need it to make queens. So any sort of late game mineral dump, you have to have the spawning pool. And life was going for more broodlords, but Innovation had another macro cycle come out, and what a thrilling game. The standard slow build up where Innovation just makes some Hellions play safe, says I want to play a macro game, and life playing really greedy and going up into Broodlord and Fester, and Innovation just matching him. And I would say that that's sort of the difference between Wings of Liberty and HOTS, is that moment where Innovation could do that double drop and get the break. But remember, Innovation did a lot to sort of limit life up to that point and pressure him and kill his infestors and attack with mines. But life was such a great defenseman that at the same time he parried those blows and made it up to Broodlord. This is what it looks like when two legends play. One guy can take a lot of damage and still sort of limp to where he needs to be, but when they both do the right thing, it's like that Hellion Queen build-up, and I said, like, well, we know life isn't going to take damage. That's because it's freaking life, and you can just count on him not making those errors. The next part will be up soon. Make sure you like and comment and sub.